Hello everybody, this is Havoc with a review of Field of Glory Empires. Developed by HOD and published by Slytherin Software, Field of Glory Empires is a simultaneous turn-based grand strategy game set in the all-so-familiar Roman Classic era. The idea is to manage various aspects of your faction to try and lead it to greatness, engaging in city building, diplomacy, trade, and of course, warfare. If this is sounding familiar, yes, this sounds very much like Imperator Rome. In fact, Slytherin's marketing director Marco Manoli has called out Paradox, saying that Empires is a better game than Imperator, which is a pretty ballsy move to me. Will this game be able to contend with Imperator Rome? You'll get to decide for yourself by the end of this review. Oh, and before we get into it, I did receive a preview copy from Slytherin, and know that it has no influence over my opinion as always. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. If you're going to call yourself a grand strategy game, it is a given that there's going to be a lot of information to display, and Empires delivers on that part for sure. City overviews, provincial overviews, empire stats, resource generation, unit stats, there is a lot to cipher through. It was certainly a bit daunting for me at first, and a big reason why I didn't get into this game for the longest time. However, it doesn't take too long to actually figure out, surfing through the relatively comprehensive info panels, and then things get quite simple, especially if you played about any other previous grand strategy title. If you're new to this genre or not, you'll still need to take some time and do some reading up before playing. It'll help you a ton. Now graphically, this game isn't something to ooh and ah about, but in no way does it mean that it is a poor quality. Take a look at most of Slytherin's published games and you'll see that pretty much across the board. HOD and Slytherin don't have the budgets of recent Total War games, and honestly, Imperator isn't that far ahead with their UI art style. The layout of most information definitely rings of a board game, and it's still pretty pleasing to me overall in the context of a grand strategy title. But if you're looking for an eye candy type of strategy game, this one isn't for you. Field of Glory Empires lets you play as one of 70 different factions spread across Europe into the fringes of India. Broken up into major, remarkable, and other, these factions are given a difficulty and interest ranking, designed to give you an idea on how your campaign might go. Selecting a faction will give you the context of that faction inside the era, some gameplay tips to succeed, and some modifiers. These modifiers have positive and negative effects on various parts of your empire and are pretty fitting for the faction. You can have as few as 2 modifiers, and I've seen as many as 8. Some of these modifiers will definitely have an influence on who you'll want to play as. For instance, Decadence has a lot of positive factors that could provide the player with several initial benefits, though they start at war with 2 of the biggest nations right off the bat. There are several playstyles that can be had with these factions, and that opens up the game quite a bit. Taking a look at the campaign map, and as you can see, there are quite a few regions you'll be able to conquer, with a lot of it open to cultural independent factions. If you played Rome Total War, this will look extremely familiar to you and will allow certain factions to expand quickly in the early game. There are several filters into the campaign map, much like Imperator, giving you access to information like loyalty, population, diplomacy, and of course ownership. You have 3 primary resources at your disposal: gold, manpower, and metal. All 3 serve the same purpose but are generated on different levels for the recruitment and upkeep of your military, the exception that metal is only used for heavy units. These 3 resources will also be bought, sold, used, or gained through decisions and events that occur within your empire. It's a pretty basic system, and it works in the context of this game, yet I don't think it would be too much to ask to see a few more usable resources implemented, such as wood for siege engines and ships, or just other resources to build specific units. The last top bar resource is your legacy points. This number is essentially your overall score in the game, and even if you were to be destroyed, it is still potentially possible to win the game if you have the most points by the end of it. Legacy points are gained per turn through objectives, regions, and unique structures, but can also be gained en masse through some events. Do what you can to always accept these, as they'll quickly get you to the top. The empire management side of things is where you'll spend 95% of your time. What seems daunting in this shot of my campaign 76 turns in is actually less complicated than it looks, well, maybe until I lay it all out. You have 4 categories of buildings on the left side that generate the resources on the right side. Each city has a randomized set of buildings they can build, each with its own effects, good or bad. Your population, comprised of citizens and slaves, only increases whatever resources you're generating. Moving pops into different categories will see increases in the category moved at the expense of decreased production in the category they were moved from. Let's take Rome for instance. Currently I'm focusing on culture, so I've taken all of my citizens from the commerce section over to the culture side. Moving them back would decrease my culture while increasing my monetary gain. Moving pops doesn't cost you anything, so you can freely switch categories to match whatever strategy you're at the time. Your buildings are free to build too, in a sense. Infrastructure production is one factor in determining how many buildings you can have in one city. Go into the negative and your buildings decay, costing you money and production. Since there are buildings that increase that infrastructure level, you'll frequently build them throughout your cities. It's a different way to manage your cities since it doesn't rely on the usual gold or other resources to build, but it works very well in empires. If managing handfuls of city is a bit much for you in the game, you can create provinces when you own half of what is considered that entire province. Once created, you'll be given a more broad overview of all regions in the province under your possession, and the option to auto-manage both where your pops will focus their generation on, as well as what your city should be focused on building. While this initially seems useful, I found that the auto function doesn't quite focus on the right things, and I usually went back and chose different buildings or applied my pops to a certain area myself. And if you choose autofocus, you'll more than likely hit some Decadence buildings, which I avoid like the plague, and I'll touch on why later in the video. I am going to sandwich the two most disappointing aspects of empires together to save us some time. Why are these my two most disappointing areas? Because they seem completely lacking in anything of depth. Trade is automatic, which isn't a terrible thing in of itself and works in other games, but the only reason to trade something is if your buildings need it to function or to provide its special bonuses. Without said resource, the building will still function, but it will cost gold to do so. If that resource can be bought within the boundaries of your trade influence, then it's just straight up auto-traded in, and you'll be paying for it, simple as that. Diplomacy is equally as lackluster. You have up to 8 basic diplomatic options. This is where the game suffers a bit. There is no negotiation. If I want peace, it's just a peace offering and a yes or a no, and that's really frustrating. This is a grand strategy game after all, and if you're going to compare yourself to something like Paradox, there needs to be more than the basics. Guarantees, defensive alliances, military access, casus bellis, exchanging of goods or regions in a diplomacy deal. You're missing a core part of a grand strategy game without a good diplomatic scene, and it holds back empires from really being up there with other grand strategy titles. No empire can expand without an army, and this game definitely has armies. Across the whole host of cultures and factions, there are over 600 different units in the game. We've already talked about the top bar resources needed to create them, now let's talk the mechanics behind it. At any given point in your campaign, from pretty much any city, you can raise as many troops as your economy and resources will allow you to. One resource not mentioned is equipment, which can be generated in smaller numbers by your general population or in larger ones by specialized buildings. Your lighter units will be significantly cheaper to recruit and maintain, costing only a small amount of gold, manpower, and equipment. Your heavier troops, in the case of Rome, legions, Italian foot, and cav, they'll require a significant investment in all 4 areas of resources. Not only that, but you're only allowed a certain amount of these troops before their cost rises steadily. This is honestly a great solution to prevent a player from doom stacking legions and heavy troops in their armies, and is one specific area that other strategy games could pick up on. Yes, I'm looking at you, Total War. Your armies once formed will have a combat power rating, a food usage rating, and movement speed. You'll need to keep this in mind, especially food usage. If your armies are somewhere they can't replenish their food supplies, they'll quickly start dying off until they can be resupplied. You also have various actions they can take within their turn. They can merge with other armies, they can enter garrisons to replenish, raid nearby regions, or even complete special tasks depending on the unit type of faction. Now here comes a pretty interesting aspect of empires. When your armies meet in battle, it will always be auto-resolve. You can choose to watch the battle take place in turn-by-turn combat style, or just see what the results would be post-battle. Terrain plays a pretty big role in this game. As such, a smaller defending army could pretty much take on a pretty big one in the right terrain and win. Winning will usually mean conquering the region you've just attacked, though if the enemy had an army outside of a fortification, you typically destroy that first, and then you'll need to assault the fortress to finally take it. There is a slight catch to what I just said. Yes, Empires only has auto-resolve battles, but if you own Field of Glory 2, which came out in October of 2017, you can actually port your battle over and manually play it. It literally exports the data, closes Empires, and opens Field of Glory 2. Once the battle is done, it closes Field of Glory and opens up Empires with the results ported back in. This really threw me off at first, and I thought it was a dumb system. But considering that these two games are made by two different developers, I began to see why it's this way. It's also surprisingly fast. Often the time it takes to complete the instance of porting to another game, opening it up, etc., is less than the time it would take to load some Total War battles. It is a very easy and cool way to tie in two completely separate games to give you the option for manual battles. Now I will forewarn you viewers who haven't played Field of Glory 2, the battles are brutally long. On average, you're looking at 30 minutes to over an hour per battle, if not longer. I've only played 2 battles in my entire campaign, and that was to make sure that I won those particular battles, since it's completely optional to manually fight. Unless you just want to have your campaign take months to complete in the real world, the auto-resolve is pretty decent and fair, and I'll be sticking to that for most of my campaign. Empires has a unique way of holding you back from steamrolling the map, Decadence and Progress. Decadence is sort of like corruption or decay. It's generated by expanding too quickly, having loyalty issues within your regions, and from not being cultured enough. Too many turns in an uncultured state will cause your faction's civilization level to age, and that's not a good thing. Progress comes pretty much solely from cultural production. Having a high ratio of progress to decadence can award you progress tokens, which will in turn progress your entire faction's civilization level, eventually leading up to a golden age. This mechanic is something that I really enjoy, and it honestly had me worried for most of my current campaign. In fact, so much so that I refused to build really any buildings that came with a decadence value, and once my foothold was established in Italy, I turned my focus to cranking on culture. That being said, the decadence mechanic does potentially need some work. Since I'm rolling in cash, making tons of food and everything I need, about 20 turns ago in my Rome campaign, I pushed all of the pops I could into culture, built as many culture buildings as was allowed in my cities, and as you can see, my ratio is massively in favor of progress, to the point where I really don't see how I'll ever have to worry about decadence again. If this continues, it's possible I could see a forever golden age and steamroll the map. I know the system, and I can cheese the system. If the devs are watching this, it would be great to know if they've seen this and it somehow levels out, or if there needs to be some sort of modifier to keep that in check. Again, I love the idea behind progress and decadence, and it's really good, but I'm currently steamrolling over this anti-steamroll mechanic, and that just doesn't seem right. I left this final subject to the end, and it doesn't really affect my opinion of Empires itself, and isn't a huge feature, but it's still something I need to mention about the game so people aren't thrown off. Empires has a simultaneous turn system much like Civ 6 multiplayer. Within your turn, you can build, engage in diplomacy, move your troops, and move around pops, but nothing actually happens. Instead, it's after you hit the end turn button that all of those actions take place, and that of every other nation. This is another area I thought would frustrate me in regards to catching armies, for instance, but it ended up working pretty well. Then, once your actions are fulfilled, you'll pop into an overview screen as the other nations do their end turns as well. This is your chance to see where your faction sits based on the actions of all the factions during that turn. The decadence progress ratio of your faction is what determines your place in the faction list, so it's 100% something you'll want to focus on to win the game. So now on to the two big questions. What do I think of Field of Glory Empires, and does it live up to the self-proclamation of being better than Imperator? In my honest opinion, Empires does not do enough justice to the grand strategy genre to boast elevation above Imperator. Yes, Empire has a stronger empire management game in its buildings and pop mechanics, and yes, Empires has a stronger army game in many ways. But it just comes down to a lack of options. Diplomacy, trade, government management, provincial edicts, characters, internal factions, the ability to maintain and influence these areas in Imperator Rome, even in its current state, is what keeps it above Empires. Were HOD to bring in more customization in just a few of these areas, we'd see a closer race in the grand strategy genre. Now that does not in any way mean that Empires is a bad game. Quite the opposite, actually. I've only pumped just over 12 to 15 hours into it, but I am very thoroughly enjoying it. I enjoy the micromanagement side of cities and pops. I can't wait to figure out how to use the navy to expand my territory over into Carthage, and since I'm slightly cheesing the progress at the moment, I really want to know what Rome's golden age looks like. Building armies and composing them to what I want is a blast and frustrating at the same time, since I can't build those stacks of legions. Empires is not a boring grand strategy game at all, and it took me by surprise once I actually dug into it and began playing. Field of Glory Empires is a solid grand strategy title, and I think will surprise a lot of the strategic community if they'll give it a chance. It's not graphically mind-blowing or impressive, but it still does shake up the genre a bit with its unique mechanics, and I believe it's another great addition to the grand strategy world. Thanks for watching my review on Field of Glory Empires. The game is out today, July 11th, and if you'd like to support the channel, you can find a Games Planet link in the description below that will take you right to it. Hope you enjoyed this look into Empires. If you did, be sure to give it an old thumbs up. If you didn't, the old thumbs down. Let me know your thoughts on the game and if you think it looks better than Imperator. Subscribe to the channel and click on the bell so you're always up to date on all things in the channel. This is Havoc, and I'll see you in the next video.